have a low-key YouTube kind of feel.
That's all right.
Go ahead.
Let me ask that the aggregate of the three presentations talked about a number of things that will definitely cost some budget potential. A new state funding formula. You talked about expanding not necessarily expanding welfare services, but at least paying for the baseline we have now, or how would you characterize it?
You're talking about my phrase in there?
Yes.
What I was discussing was the fact that if we don't turn our economic situation around, we jeopardize the existing infrastructure that's in place.
Right.
In other words, so our economic crisis imperils the social safety net that exists currently.
Right.
So what we have to do is we have to begin rebuilding our economy, which everybody knows can't happen overnight. We need to take the basic steps now. We have to get economic policy turned around so that businesses begin to consider moving to our island. Most businesses don't even think about it. So that's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about an expansion of social services. We're talking about the desperate need to fix the economy where we can't even keep the social services we have right now.
Does that mean that you don't see that as an area that needs either cuts or reforms or efficiencies to be found, wherever you want to phrase that?
I believe that there's certainly efficiencies to be found in there. I'm fairly certain there's probably a lot of fraud buried within social services, whether it's Medicaid fraud or Medicare fraud, or whether it's people on welfare who shouldn't be. And we certainly need to get into that and we get the fraud out of there, and then we'll see what we have.
And then do we need new money to pay for a new education funding formula, or is this just money alone?
I think for starters, we should take the pie that we have right now and divvy it up fairly proportionally based on need and what the numbers dictate. So we don't even have that. The monies that we have right now are not being distributed fairly and equitably. So put that in place right now, and then we have to figure out the budgetary numbers. I mean, everything depends on a healthy economy, and with a sick economy, we can't even begin considering what the budgets may or may not be as our tax base shrinks. Right? All we know is it's going to be smaller next year than last year.
In the funding formula debate, you'll hear that the terms fair and equitable have many different meanings to people. What do you characterize that any further? I know it's kind of a dry way to ask the question, but I don't want to put
it comes down to number of students, and it comes down to need. I mean, it's going to be a battle, I'm sure, to come up with exactly what this formula is going to be. If you're going to write the formula on a napkin, and that's be a cocktail napkin, I imagine the size of this table by the time you're done with it, essentially by the time the legislative process is done. But we need something that everybody can take a look at this in the computer world deterministic, right? You have to be able to know what you're going to get based on the numbers. So we have to do that, it has to happen, and I imagine it'll be iterative. We'll probably come up with a formula in year one, and it'll probably change in year two as you tweak it and get it. So.
And you talked about wanting to get away from the extreme right and the extreme left. I've seen in other interviews where you kind of describe what you think the extreme right is. Can you comment on that? But I'd be interested to have a couple of examples of what constitutes the extreme right.
Sure. I mean, to a large extent, it's represented by the progressive element of the Democratic Party, and a lot of the extreme left is encapsulated a lot in their economic policy issues. For instance, the vehemence against the flat tax on the part of the extreme left. I mean, it's almost a reverse set of class support government. So, we can't succeed as a state economically while we're disincenting businesses and business people from operating. So, from a socioeconomic perspective, you've got to be competitive with your neighbors, bottom line. And oftentimes the progressive economic element really doesn't go after that end of it at all. They don't seem to understand the fact that we have two gas stations next to each other, one selling gas for $2.50 a gallon, and the other 18% higher, whereas where we are with flat tax right now, it's $2.95 a gallon. So you have Rhode Island and Massachusetts side-by-side gas stations. You're going to go to the cheaper gas station if you go to Massachusetts.
And my last question, on a slightly lighter note, I saw Chairman Parenti's picture in the Providence Journal today, standing in front of a picture of a rhinoceros. Is that an attempt to make the rhinoceros your official symbol?
I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware of that yet, but we're still having an open debate about what that should be.
All right, thank you.
To follow up on what Andrew said. I was actually a little surprised at the emphasis on government in economic solutions. For example, federal money and loans, taking out bonds. Would you rely on economic growth driven by those loans in order to pay back the loans? Are you thinking of cuts that would parallel? Is it a zero-sum kind of borrowing structure, or are you hoping that the economy will advance enough to cover the debt?
I believe that what you build has to fund itself ultimately. It has to be self-sustaining. To build a white elephant is not anything that anybody needs at this point in time, right? If you build something that becomes a further drag economically on the state finances, that's not the way. So pick the project carefully, vet it, make sure that it will self-sustain when you have it built. That's the only way to do it.
But you'll still have the loan, so the project itself will pay for the loan, the bond.
My plan on that, what I'm thinking is that what you build has to be able to sustain itself and pay for it until tomorrow. Yes.
And you mentioned an emphasis on the welfare, the social safety net, without mentioning any cuts there too. Do you have a concern that Rhode Island is a welfare magnet that attracts people in the region who are attracted to that sort of giveaway culture?
I'm an adherent to, I guess, what a lot of people would describe as classical economics. I believe that the consumer behaves in a predictable way. In the same way that businesses are consumers, and they will go where the cost of doing business is less expensive. The analog is also true, and individuals will come where you get a better deal. And I do believe that in many ways Rhode Island has more generous social services and benefits than some of our neighbors, and I believe that's destined to attract people.
So you said you wanted to keep the welfare, the social safety net that we have. Are you actually saying you want to decrease it?
What I said was, our social safety net is in peril because our finances our lack of finances and our shrinking economic base imperils the existing safety net the way it is. That's exactly what I said.
Okay.
So, do I believe ultimately that we have to take a hard look at health and human services and a hard look at what we're doing with benefits? Absolutely. Look, our unemployment benefits are rich compared to some of our neighbors, and we have a $300 million deficit in our unemployment. What do you do? And by the way, that $300 million is not tallied up on the state debt. That doesn't show up in the deficit numbers when you hear the governor and everyone else talking about it. Where does that $300 million come from? It almost doubles the size of the deficit.
Yeah.
So, there's sleight of hand going on even today, where we're not owning up to the debts that we have.
Okay. And a few quick hits. Same-sex marriage?
For me, same-sex marriage ultimately comes down to a question of civil rights.
So if the General Assembly hands you something,
if the General Assembly handed me a bill for same-sex marriage, I would sign it, but I would make it clear that I expected to see a balanced budget first.
Okay, so on that you're a social liberal. What about abortion?
On abortion, I grew up pro-choice.
What about immigration?
In immigration, I believe that E-Verify is the answer to immigration problems. It's the law of the land. Employers are supposed to employ documented legal workers, and I believe using E-Verify to prove that is required really in this day and age. And I think that simply by forcing employers to follow existing law that's there, I think to a large extent the problem of illegal immigration would be mitigated.
Well, apart from employers, what about for such thing as public education, public medical attention, public safety net? Should illegal immigrants especially should that be available to them?
That's a much harder question for me to answer. From my perspective, it's very difficult to take people who essentially integrated themselves now into society and excise them with a knife and cast them out. So I don't believe that amnesty or anything like that you talk about, but I do believe that if we enforce the job laws, that the problem will begin to rectify itself.
And a last question, particularly from things that Mr. Crenti has said here and in the press, I got the impression a lot of what he's complaining about, say the legislative grants, is nothing that people haven't said before. Are you worried that with two parties offering essentially the low-hanging fruit of Rhode Island corruption, the message will be diluted, perhaps giving an opportunity for the Democrats to say, yeah, me too, on legislative grants?
Look, if they said me too on legislative grants and got rid of them, we all win, right? I mean, it's not so much a question of whose idea it is or who's proposing it. We got to get the changes made. So getting rid of legislative grants, fantastic idea. Who cares who sponsored it? As long as we get it in.
Oh, that's as far as a candidate.
So, I'm sorry?
As far as candidates, with that message, there's a difference between everybody agreeing once they're in office and everybody agreeing on the campaign trail.
There certainly is, and I believe that if we do our job right as a party, and we really get people engaged and get people listening, I think we'll start to get better legislating out of the people incumbents in there right now, because they're going to see what's coming at them, and I think they're going to start behaving.